Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was March 22nd, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Oh my goodness, where do I even begin with today's document? Oh wow. Alright, well, let's start with just the basics, and then we're going to see how this document is. Ooh. Well, it seems completely innocuous, and rather just another document of pleasantries from one monarch to another. But because of the work that we've already been doing this year, it is, in my mind, explosive. But I don't know, maybe I'm just being dramatic. Here's the basics. It's from Violant. It is in the Secret Seal Register, the new one that's starting out. This is on folio 3V of the Curiae Sigilli Secreti Register, and the addressee is the King of France. Now you might think at first, oh, well, this is, two powerful people in correspondence. But actually, at this time, Charles VI, King of France, has not yet wrested political control, from his uncles. And so, even though he seems like, in my mind, old enough to really be ruling the kingdom, because he's 19 at this time, his uncles have been preventing him from exiting the period of regency. And so the Duc de Berry and the Duke of Burgundy, they are still the ones in charge. And it's only about a year from this point that Charles VI figures out how to get out from under their regency, to take political control, and to sideline his two uncles. So when Violant is writing to him, she is writing to somebody who's she knows is not yet in charge. Not sure that makes any gigantic difference here. The date is, today's date, March 22nd. And the letter starts out, pleasant, humdrum pleasantries. Hope you're doing well. Please send us word of your health and how things are going. And then once we get into the end of line 5, we get some interesting stuff. So, all right. The enfants. Okay, nostres enfants sum sans e en bona dispositio de nostres persones. All right, so the children are in good health, good disposition of our person. Okay, persons. Then the next sentence. E quel signore marit e signor nostre molt car. This is the equivalent of molt cara companiona. So Joan is always writing about Violant as molt cara companiona. And Violant writes about Joan as Signor Nostre molt car. Well, what's going on with Signor Nostre molt car? Signor Nostre molt car es en tanta convalescencia de sa malaltia que dins breu s'espera esser guarit perfectament. Gracias a Nostra Señor Deu. All right. I'm sure that people who've already listened to a bunch of episodes have had their ears perk up at certain words, like malaltia, illness, convalescencia, convalescence. And then, for those of you who are super sharp, you might remember that on March 5th, how many days is that? March 5th to March 22nd, 17 days ago, Violant used pretty much the exact same phrase, dins breu esser guardit perfectement. She used that same phrase in a letter to the Duke of Burgundy. And in that letter on March 5th, that phrase means, in a short time, he's going to be in perfect health. Now, March 22nd, que dins breu respera esser guardit perfectement. That in a short time, it is hoped he will be in perfect health. He's convalescing from his illness. On March 22nd, his perfect health is something that is hoped for in the future. On March 5th, his perfect health is something that was hoped for as a future state. Now, do you remember what we talked about 2 days ago on March 20th? 2 days ago, on March 20th, Joan was writing to a different monarch, the King of Navarre. On March 20th, he wrote that he was deliberado e bien quitio del accidente de nuestra persona. That he had been delivered and fully done with the misfortune. That he's essentially, it's all behind him. So, look at this. Damage control. And how we're getting these different stories from the different people at different times. All in this effort to reassure their audiences that the health of the king is good and not bad. The king's two bodies is a phrase that evokes this state of, it's like a metaphorical understanding of the power of the king and how it connected to the legitimacy of his rule. That if the body of the king is healthy, then that is a powerful metaphor for a successful reign. And if the body of the king is not healthy, then there's a tension that arises because there's this association symbolically between the physical body of that human being, the king, and the body of the country, the realm. And of course, the person who did the foundational work on this is Ernst Kantorowicz, whose book, The King's Two Bodies, is still very, very foundational and well-cited and has had some updates to it, but the initial insight is one that has just been a standard for understanding the way that medieval political elites saw the relationship between the human being, the king, and then the kingdom, the realm. So it's interesting also to think about in terms of rulership today, because there is absolutely an anxiety on the part of political leaders to project good health. I mean, we just have had a series of, pair of presidencies dominated by this issue, where we saw Joe Biden in the United States basically have these health problems, and it led to political disaster for his party. And now we've got a president who is obviously elderly, but acting in a way that is desperate to show virulence, strength, and health. So these concepts, these associations of healthiness and its connection to political strength, they are deep in really ingrained in Western civilization, and maybe even beyond Western civilization, I don't know. But, I mean, certainly within the political traditions, the symbolic meanings that are associated with power, political power, and governance. So, look at how in this narrative that's emerging about Joan's body, we are just going on this roller coaster. You know what I like to imagine is what was going through the minds of the scribes as they were writing these things down. Because it's like one day he's totally fine, and the next day we're talking about, he's still got some more convalescence, and it's going to be a short I mean, they know, right? I mean, the people that are surrounding Joan, they know his health condition in the present. And so are they just kind of thinking, all right, well, I'm going to write this down, and hopefully they believe it. And hopefully they're not talking to each other. Hopefully we don't have the King of Navarre in correspondence with the King of France and the Duke of Burgundy. Hopefully they're not comparing notes, right? I mean, you can just imagine the King of France, this 19-year-old, receiving this letter and saying, "Hey, Uncle, Duke of Burgundy, looks like Joan, the new king in the Crown of Aragon, is going to be back in perfect health in a short time." And then the Duke of Burgundy says, "Well, that's kind of funny, because 17 days ago I got a letter that said he was going to be in perfect health in just a short time." So, I guess they are not terribly concerned with how these recipients of these messages might be comparing notes. I'm not sure how much we can read into that. Maybe they knew that these folks didn't really talk to each other all that much, and they didn't have to worry about it. But it is interesting, and when I see stuff like this, this is corroboration, okay? This is the heart of what historians do with the historical thinking skill, corroboration. The ability to look at these different documents and to compare them in order to try to get beyond the face value reading of each one. We're reading these, especially today's, against the grain, right? Because at face value, this is just a simple pleasantries exchange that is just very general and wouldn't raise any concerns. It minimizes Joan's illness, but when we corroborate, when we look at the longer story and look at all these documents in which Joan's illness has been downplayed or erased, and then certain moments where it peeks through, like in some of the letters that Violant sent to her family members, like her father, Robert de Bar. And then when we see this inconsistency between them, like when we're comparing what Joan wrote on March 20th to what Violant wrote on March 22nd, we're seeing that we have access to a different interpretation than just the face value of what the documents say. And that ability to kind of trace through and read against the grain and to kind of keep it all in your head over time, that is the mark of someone who is doing historical thinking. And when you can layer on top of that something that I don't have, which is, say, like 20 years of experience of looking at these documents and thinking and reading about the historical context, then you have expertise. Okay? So part of the mission of this podcast is to attempt to explain what historical expertise actually looks like in practice. And what we've got today is an excellent illustrative example of how historical expertise will get you something in terms of understanding what happened with historical subjects, people of the past, that you wouldn't get from just a quick glance and looking at the document and reading it at face value. So this episode, in my mind, is a super important one and foundational to the whole idea of the project, being able to get to this point. And I feel a little bit like lucky that like my mind was able to kind of recall the earlier letters from the one from March 20th was not as hard to recall, but going back to the one from the Duke of Burgundy, I did that by searching through what I had. I just put a search in the program that I'm using to write up all the website pages. It's called Visual Studio Code. I put the word DINS, D-I-N-S, because I was like, I think I knew that. I think that phrase came up. So I did just a keyword search for that. And I was able to see that I had a little bit in the close reading section on that webpage about that. And that's the only way that I was able to get back to March 5th. I could have easily, on the March 5th episode, chosen something else to focus on for the close reading. I mean, it does make sense that I would choose that because I'm trying to track how Joan's illness is being referred to. But it is almost like a bit of an instinctual move for me to have done that on March 5th. And I didn't know that it would benefit me on March 22nd. So that is a little bit more of an explicit breakdown of how I was able to get to this point. And I hope that when we get to this big letter that Josep Roca is working from in his analysis, it's a big letter on April 27th that Violant sends to the Pope, in which she just like lets loose. And this is the letter that says that Joan at some point was administered last rites. And Roca thinks that was in January. That what Violant is describing is something that took place in January. And I have to try to figure out what he's seeing that leads him to place the episode that Violant is describing that far in the past and not later on, like say, I don't know, like something that happens in more close to when Violant is writing that letter in April. So that's one of the key things I'm trying to figure out as I'm looking at the way that Joan's health is described. And also, let's remember the lens of disability studies, in which we see that any of Joan's incapacitations physically as a result of this illness are being anxiously made invisible through the work of all of these people around him, especially the scribes that are doing the writing for him. And who knows how often, like in that one document from February 20th where he says, I wasn't able to sign this, how often is his signature essentially being, I wouldn't go so far as saying forged, because he's authorizing the scribes to sign it for him, but it's being presented as his signature when really it's not his actual hand that wrote it. All right, so a seemingly nondescript, non-controversial letter that actually, in comparison to the other documentation and all of the work that we've been doing, turns out to have this explosive character to it. So that's one of the joys of doing this project, is being able to surface that. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, including links to all of the different episodes that I have referred to in this one. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.